Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be covering a topic from Cambridge IGCSE Biology, the topic of characteristics and classification of living organisms. And this is the second part of the subtopic, concept and uses of classification systems. Now, in our first video, we basically discussed about what classification is, and we discussed about the Linnaean system of classification and the binomial naming system and so on. And in this video, in the second part, we're going to be discussing about how classification systems reflect evolutionary relationships between organisms. So that's what we're focusing on over here. We're focusing on the evolutionary relationships between organisms, and this is an extended part. All right. Now, when we talk about classification systems, the aim of a successful classification system is basically to reflect the evolutionary relationships between the organisms within a particular group. Now, if you think about this scientifically, how is it that certain organisms share similar features? For example, if you consider the group of mammals, we know that all mammals, all these organisms, have bodies covered in hair and they feed their young from mammary glands. So how exactly did this come about? How did all mammals get these common characteristics of being able to feed their young from their mammary glands and their bodies being covered in hair? How did these common features come about? So basically, the answer is this. It is that all these organisms, all these mammals, they share these common features because all these organisms have descended from a common ancestor. So organisms share features because they originally descend from a common ancestor, right? So in the case of mammals, it is believed that all mammals descended from a common ancestor that lived about 200 million years ago. So all mammals are related because they share this common ancestor. All right, now when talking about classification systems, originally organisms were grouped, organisms were classified using morphology and anatomy. So based on their form and their shape and their internal body structures, organisms were put into different groups. But now, as technology advanced, microscopes, knowledge of biochemistry, and eventually the DNA sequencing allowed us to take this classification, take this grouping system into a more scientific approach. So what is done now is that the DNA sequences of different species are considered, and the more similar the base sequences are in the DNA of two species, the more closely related these two species are. So here's what is being done now. You are considering the DNA base sequences, and if the base sequences are more similar to one another, if they are more similar to one another, we say that these organisms are more closely related to one another. That is the modern system of classification. That's what is being done now that technology has advanced and DNA sequencing of every organism is being done. So we consider these DNA-based sequences of every organism, and the more similar these DNA-based sequences are, we say that these organisms are more closely related to one another. All right. So let's take a look at an example, which is given here in the next slide. So given here are the DNA-based sequences of a few vertebrates. You can see that they've given the base sequences of a mouse, rat, human, pig, dog, chicken, frog. This is just part of their DNA, right? So all these organisms, we know these are all vertebrates. Right? These are all vertebrates. Now, if we consider the mouse and the rat and the human and the pig and the dog, we know that these are all mammals. And if we consider the chicken, we know that the chicken is a bird. And if we think about the frog, we know that the frog is an amphibian. All right. So we're just going to look at the DNA base sequences of these 5 mammals, of the bird, and of the amphibian. And we're going to come to a few conclusions based on these DNA base sequences. All right. Now, the DNA base sequences here show that the mouse, rat, human, pig, and dog, these DNA base sequences are very similar to each other. Just take a second to analyze this. You can see all these base sequences, they are all similar to all these 5 organisms. Similar base sequences all the way, except maybe at this point, there are few variations in the base sequences at one particular point. Apart from this, all the base sequences of all these mammals, and apart from this point and this point, all the base sequences are exactly similar. So very similar base sequences among these 5 organisms mean that these 5 organisms are very, very closely related to one another. And we know that, right? Because we know that all these 5 organisms belong to mammals. So can you see how the DNA base sequences reflect the evolutionary relationships? All these organisms who have very similar base sequences have evolved from a common ancestor, and they are all grouped with a group of mammals. And if you go on to, let's do a small comparison. Let's compare the DNA sequence of a mammal, let's take the dog, and a bird, which is the chicken. So if you consider these 2 base sequences, you can see that, yes, there are a few points where the base sequences are similar to each other, but there are more variations among these base sequences. You can see that, right? More variations. So more variations in their DNA base sequencing means that they are more distantly related to one another. So this is exactly what we mean by DNA-based sequences can show how closely related organisms are. So the base sequences in a mammal's DNA are more closely related to all other mammals than any other vertebrate groups. All these mammals, their base sequences are more similar to each other, so we say that they are more closely related to one another than they are to the other vertebrate groups. So this is the theory of this section. Let's now take a look at a question from the question bank. All right, so here's a question from this section. It says that the chimpanzee and the bonobo are closely related species. What is the most reliable way of determining how closely 2 species are related? So it states that these 2 organisms are closely related, and they are asking you, what is the most reliable way for determining how closely the 2 species are related? So how do we determine how closely related 2 species are? Do we compare and contrast their anatomy? Definitely not. We don't consider the anatomical features, no. Do we examine their morphologies? Again, no, we don't do it based on morphology either anymore. Those are the traditional methods. Is it that other species evolutionary ties can be compared? Again, no, this is not the most appropriate answer. Or is it that we compare their DNA-based sequences? Yes, this is definitely how we determine how closely related they are. So the answer is definitely answer number 4. Compare their DNA-based sequences. So that's all for today's video. I hope all of you got a good understanding how DNA-based sequences determine how closely related two species are.
Subscribe us now for more videos and content.